evening and welcome to the world today. Tonight we're going to discuss the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, a country which is undergoing change of sorts at the moment, but where repression continues and effectively the old structures remain in place, except that one faction of the royal family seems to have grabbed power at the expense of others. This is certainly new, and the way they've done it is very new. So Saudi Arabia, major player in the Middle East, waging the cruel, brutal war in Yemen with the support of the West. Very difficult to find any serious criticism of this government on a regular or even an irregular basis in the Western media. Very few serious studies of what is going on in this country inside the academy. We'll discuss that later, but tonight I have as my guest Madawi Al-Rasheed, who does provide serious criticism, who is an academic, currently a visiting professor in the Middle East Studies Department of the London School of Economics, and more importantly, is a Saudi Arabian herself. Having left that country years ago, she has been one of the more constructive but yet sharp critics of the Saudi regime. Her latest book that she has edited is Salman's Legacy. Salman is the current king of Saudi Arabia. Salman's Legacy, The Dilemmas of a New Era in Saudi Arabia, published last February. Madawi, great to have you with us. But before we switched on the cameras, you were telling me about a very serious incident that has taken place regarding your nephew. Could you please tell me that again?
Yes, it is a very interesting story, but very sad and dramatic. I think it reflects how the Saudi regime at the moment is willing to go as far as kidnapping people outside the country, bringing them against their will. And this is my nephew, Nawaf bin Talal Al-Rasheed, who is a very young man who has never been political in his life. His father was a famous poet who was assassinated in Algeria in 2003, and up to now we don't know how he was assassinated or who is responsible for it. His mother is Qatari citizen, and he, after the assassination of his father, went to live in Qatar with his mother. He was visiting Kuwait. He drove to the airport with his companions in order to go back to Doha, where he lives, and since then he's disappeared. 2 days later, there was an announcement by the Ministry of Interior in Kuwait saying that he was handed over to Saudi Arabia on a plane from Kuwait airport because the Saudis have requested that.
Madawi, have you any idea as to why your nephew was picked up? Do we know the charges, what they're accusing him of, or are they going to use him as a hostage against someone else? Do we have
It's
any?
very difficult to know, but my guess is that his name remains problematic for the Saudi regime because he comes from this Al-Rasheed family that ruled Saudi Arabia until 1921.
That's your family?
That is my family. And up till now, they have not gone beyond this historical complex. They always fear that the name Al-Rasheed will come back and haunt them, or any member of the family would have a dream to go back and rule that part of Saudi Arabia. But if it tells us something, this story about Mohammed bin Salman, the current crown prince, it tells us that he is insecure, that a young man at the age of 29 who has never been political in his life creates a kind of unease, and he will go out of his way to bring him from outside Saudi Arabia in order not to allow any member of the Al-Rasheed to exist outside Saudi Arabia. Because since his disappearance on the 13th of May, we have not heard anything about the man.
Has this been reported in any Western newspaper?
The incident has been reported by Amnesty International and by other media in the Arab world. Unfortunately, none of this has been written about in the Western media. But this incident was followed by further arrest, and the recent one that the Western media had taken was the arrest of 7 women in Saudi Arabia who are activists, and in fact, many of them had called for the ban on driving to be lifted, which is going to happen on the 24th of June, but they were accused of being traitors and working for foreign governments or foreign entities, and therefore they are putting them in prison now.
Just before we move on to discuss Saudi Arabia in more detail, Madawi, have you, as an exile and was a citizen now of Britain, but have you ever been threatened, given that you write and speak very openly?
Yes, early on I was threatened, and the Saudi regime went to my father, because as a woman I don't have a legal I'm not a legal person. I'm not a legal person. So they went through my father to send the message that if I continue to publish a book that was called A History of Saudi Arabia, they will take disciplinary action. But this disciplinary action has to be taken abroad, and I think at the time it was a campaign to intimidate me. And obviously I did publish the book, but the danger is still there, and especially after what happened to my cousin.
Let us now turn to what is going on in Saudi Arabia, because if you read the mainstream media in most of Europe, there are a few critical voices, not too many, and the United States. The image that is being created is a huge PR fantasy that we now have a crown prince. He is the great modernizer. His father has put him in charge to run the country, and Saudi Arabia is going to be transformed from what it was into something totally different. How different? What is going to be the difference? They're not interested in. But put this in context, Madawi, the changes that have taken place, to my mind, have been in a power grab, effectively, by this wing of the family, which in the past, whatever their other defects, and there were many, they tended to keep their differences quiet and sort it out amongst themselves, and not actually share power, but understand the needs for some form of sharing, especially money. This guy puts a lot of cousins in relations, locks them up appropriately in a 5-star hotel, but nonetheless, what is the reason for this style of behavior?
Yes, there are two parts to your question. First, the role of Western media that had actually gone out of its way to polish his image and promote him as the new face of Saudi Arabia, a reformist and a revolutionary crown prince who will soon become king. I think we have to understand that in the West in general, every time there is a new Saudi king, they go out of their way to promote this new face, and they did it during the reign of King Faisal, then King Fahd, then Abdullah, and there was a recent article showing how the New York Times had actually always endorsed Saudi kings. When King Saud, who was hailed as the most corrupt Saudi king, who had plundered the wealth of Saudi Arabia, arrived in the US in the late 1950s, early 60s, the New York Times published articles about how he is the reformist king. And this goes on until we reach Thomas Friedman's article that he wrote recently when he visited Saudi Arabia, and he described King Salman, and specifically his son, as the greatest reformer of all kings. So this promotion of each and every Saudi king and official is part of the Western narrative about Saudi Arabia. In the West, nobody wants to actually recognize and admit that there are serious problems in Saudi Arabia, ranging from freedom of expression or lack of, to serious violence against society by the regime, to curbing religious freedom. All these kind of problems they do not want to know. As long as the money keeps flowing from Saudi Arabia to the West in the form of investment, of arms purchases, in terms of intelligence sharing, and therefore the West is actually happy to live with a dictatorship like the Saudi regime. And this is in line with what they have done in other parts of the world. And in fact, what they do is they support these dictators until they play the role they wanted them to play. And after that, they would abandon this dictator and even go to extreme to topple him, like exactly what happened in Iraq. Saddam Hussein was receiving chemical weapons and armaments in order to fight Iran after the revolution in Iran. Once that role is over, then they moved in, imposed sanctions on him, and in 2003 moved in militarily to topple him. And the Saudi situation is not different. So the West will go out of its way to polish the image of this new prince who is called a reformer, a top-down revolutionary, transforming Saudi Arabia. It's almost like they are selling a utopia to make the image of Saudi Arabia positive in the West and encourage investment going from the West to Saudi Arabia and vice versa. And this is exactly what happened. However, the repression that I mentioned early on, the arrest of these women activists puts a punctures this narrative about the reformist king. So that's the first part of your question. The second part relates to how Saudi Arabia is transformed. The young prince is desperate to become the number one in Saudi Arabia. And this is a structural shift from what had existed before. Saudi Arabia was a fiefdom of multiple princes until the death of King Abdullah in 2015 and the arrival of King Salman to the throne. So we take, for example, Prince Mohammed bin Nayef, who was the Minister of Interior, the head of the intelligence. He was actually responsible for the domestic security of the regime. King Salman and his son dismissed him and marginalized him, and actually he was sacked as a crown prince. Then comes the elite, the entrepreneurs among the princes, such as Al-Walid bin Talal, who was humiliated and taken to a five-star hotel, the Ritz-Carlton, but also he had to pay ransom money, like all of them, under the guise of fighting corruption. But in fact, what happened in Saudi Arabia was a purge to get rid of all competitors, cousins and brothers, etc., and promote Mohammed bin Salman as the new face of Saudi Arabia. In addition, Mohammed bin Salman had to sell himself to the West as the new face of Saudi Arabia. And he knows, his PR companies know what triggers this kind of welcome in the West. So lifting the ban on women's driving, allowing them to drive, opening cinemas in Saudi Arabia, allowing women to go to football matches. All this is hailed as the new reform of Saudi Arabia. But this is the veneer that hides serious and really dangerous repression.
It's sort of very unusual for something to happen in Saudi Arabia without a green light from Washington. The relations between the United States and the Saudi Kingdom, ever since the Americans took over from the British in running this country with the Saud family, which was in the middle of the Second World War, nothing much of any import has happened without the Americans approving it. What is the feeling? Have we got any evidence that this was cleared with them, this new shift in Saudi Arabia?
Absolutely. The relationship between the US and Saudi Arabia came under strain during the Obama administration. Yeah. And this was so obvious because Obama was like hands off. He wanted actually to reintegrate Iran in the international community. And the Iran nuclear deal that he signed with several other European countries, China and Russia, made the Saudis feel very, very insecure, simply because they thought the Americans will go behind their back and actually open channels of communication to Iran. And therefore, they are not the number one that the US relies on in the Arab world after Israel, because the US had always had its regional powers. So when Donald Trump was elected and he took office, there was a shift in the American foreign policy towards Saudi Arabia. And Donald Trump tried to endear the Saudis. This has happened very quickly, and I'm sure there were some preparation for this, that Donald Trump and his administration find Mohammed bin Salman as an eager, young Saudi prince who can be easily manipulated.
We've become very good friends over a fairly short period of time. I was in Saudi Arabia in May. Some of the things that have been approved and are currently under construction and will be delivered to Saudi Arabia very soon, and that's for their protection. But if you look in terms of dollars, $3 billion, $533 million, $525 million, that's peanuts for you. Should have increased it. $880 million, $645 million, $6 billion, that's for frigates.
Everybody thought that Mohammed bin Nayef, the crown prince who was sacked in 2015, was going to be the future king as a crown prince. But within a week, Mohammed bin Nayef was given a medal by the CIA to reward him for his efforts at fighting Al-Qaeda and terrorism in the Arabian Peninsula and elsewhere. And the Americans shifted towards Mohammed bin Salman, which makes us think that maybe there was a deal, that the US will put its full weight behind Mohammed bin Salman, but there are conditions that he should do. One of them is to create this hype about the cosmetic reforms, allow women to drive, but most importantly is the relationship with Israel.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Yes. Since Mr. Trump was planning to move the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, and this has happened, Saudi Arabia had kept a low profile. There were no loud voices saying that we object. Of course, there are vague statements and rhetoric, but Saudi Arabia has retreated from supporting the Palestinian cause, and perhaps this is exactly what Mr. Trump and his administration wanted.
So American support for this latest cosmetic change in Saudi Arabia obviously also means that the war in Yemen, which the Saudis are waging, unusually for them, they tend to do things from behind the scenes, maneuver, come to deals or not, threaten, blackmail, but actually sending troops in to Yemen was another shift for them and couldn't have been carried out without support from Washington because the West is arming them. The British in Europe are the most dominant, and the United States in Washington. So it's obvious that this war couldn't carry on. I mean, it's a vicious, brutal war without the backing of the West.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the war started in 2015, and that was even at the time when Obama was president. And my guess is that because Saudi Arabia made a big fuss about the Iran nuclear deal and the signing of that deal and rehabilitation of Iran in the international community, Mr. Obama allowed the Saudis to go into Yemen, and other Western allies did exactly that. And the arms are coming, as you rightly pointed out, from the US, from Britain, and from France and other European countries. And it is very difficult, even with attempts to sort of bring these governments to accountability, to say that the arms you are selling Saudi Arabia are actually killing people in Yemen and precipitating a humanitarian crisis unseen in this poorest Arab country. Nothing is being done because it is a war that is keeping Mohammed bin Salman busy there, and in fact he's reached the point now where they are looking for a peaceful solution, because the bombing from the sky did not lead to the victory that he wanted to prove that he is actually a national hero. He had protected Saudis from Yemeni threats, or really by implication Iranian threat. But we see that 3-4 years after this conflict started, that Houthis, the supposedly Yemeni group that is backed by the Iranians, are sending missiles into Riyadh and the southern border of Saudi Arabia. So he hasn't succeeded in eliminating the Houthis, who are part of the fabric of Yemeni society
and have
and
been
politics.
for a long, long time.
Yes, absolutely. Basically, their objective is to keep Yemen weak. And this has been going on since the 1930s. Yemen has institutions, and it is a very unique society, actually. It's a situation where we find that the government, the state is very weak, but society is very strong. And therefore, this frightens Saudi Arabia because Yemen also is more populous than Saudi Arabia. Every time I think about Saudi Arabia and Yemen, what comes to my mind is the US and its neighbor, Mexico, and whereby there are so many Yemeni immigrants who are actually working in Saudi Arabia. Those are sometimes used by the Saudi regime to put pressure on the Yemeni government, such as what they did in 1990 when they expelled 1 million Yemenis back to Yemen and created an economic crisis for the Yemeni government.
Madawi, the apologists for Saudi Arabia, are very prominent in the American US Senate and House of Representatives, but also in the House of Commons, in this country where we live. And recently, an attempt by the new Corbyn leadership of the Labour Party to ask for an arms embargo on Saudi Arabia because of the war in Yemen was defeated, and largely defeated because over 50 Labour MPs did not vote for it. In 2016, there'd been another vote where if the Labour MPs had all voted for their own leadership's resolution, the government would have lost. And this is incredibly disturbing. So how the Saudis can win over even right-wing Blairite social democrats is something to think about. Are they being paid off? How are they being influenced?
Well, it is, I think, money, the power of money in a new economy. Britain is very insecure at the moment, and it can see how its economy is going to shrink as a result of Brexit, and therefore it wants to maintain the trade relations that it had with Saudi Arabia and many other countries. So it is not an urgent issue to actually tell the Saudis that, what you are doing is wrong, you've got to stop. But also there is another argument that the Western government have used in the past, and that is Saudi Arabia is important to us for fighting terrorism, for sharing intelligence. And this is actually really contradictory, because a country that produced so many terrorists as a result of the government's policy to spread its radical jihadi ideology outside the borders of Saudi Arabia is actually treated as a partner in the fight against terrorism. And therefore, the West hasn't actually learned a lesson from its previous practices since the Second World War in the Arab world, that when they put all their weight behind these Arab dictators, that was counterproductive. The Arab dictators are not a shield against terrorism. In fact, they are the producers of terrorism. But there is a fascination by these dictators' ability to control the population. So basically, if we're talking about real politics, they think that the dictators are the best because they do not have representative governments. No government is going to check the arms sales, no transparency, and Western governments prefer to work with these opaque systems like the Saudi one.
Often, when at these times of crisis in the Middle East, which seems to be non-stop at the moment, one thinks that if there was a popular uprising in Saudi Arabia, it's obvious the regime and its allies would try and crush it. But what is very rarely written about, except by people like yourself, is what is Saudi society like? How does it function?
I mean, Saudi society is very, very weak. It is fragmented along regional, sectarian, tribal lines, and the government allows for this fragmentation to develop because it means that the society will not be able to act as a national unit. And the more the fragmentation, the better. And therefore, the regime can survive as long as Saudi society remains fragmented and big sections of it marginalized. And they have staged a revolt, they have been engaged in politics, but every time it gets crushed. And doesn't mean that this will not ever happen in the future. It's just at the moment, as Saudi Arabia is contributing to inflaming the region, from Yemen all the way to Syria, Saudis have had second thought about regime change or second thought about how they should challenge the regime, because they are seriously worried about regimes being toppled and then replaced by civil wars, exactly like what happened in Syria and also in Iraq.
But Madawi, just a percentage of the population in sort of religious terms?
It's very difficult to know, but we know that, for example, the eastern part of Saudi Arabia is actually got a very prominent Shia minority. In the west, where the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, the Hijaz, is populated by Sunni Muslims who have had a history of Sufi tradition, not a Wahhabi tradition. The Wahhabi tradition is focused in the center of the country. But because of the support of the government, it had spread everywhere.
And yet these Wahhabis, as we have seen from the foundation of the country onwards, have a very elastic conscience. For instance, to fight against the Ottomans, okay, that's one thing. But then fighting against them because they are not good Muslims, which was the Wahhabi claim, and then you link first to the British Empire and subsequently to the American Empire. I mean, how can Wahhabi theology justify that?
Absolutely possible, because they're very pragmatic. And the Saudi government actually uses them to justify all sorts of decisions they made, such as, for example, inviting foreign troops to defend Saudi Arabia in 1990. The Wahhabi establishment issued a fatwa, a religious decree, to say it's permissible for a country to use non-Muslims to defend the two holy mosques. And that was fine. And the other strategy the government uses in order to incorporate the Wahhabi is to give them a carte blanche in controlling society. So they have their area of control. They can interfere in people's relationship with each other. They could monitor public morality. People in Saudi Arabia at one point became really obsessed by religion in terms of what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do, to the extent whereby any kind of fun was outlawed, such as going to the cinema. And therefore the government allows them a free hand to control society. But now Mohammed bin Salman is changing that and trying to roll back their influence and promote Saudi Arabia as a modern country, a normal country where people could relax and go to have fun in concerts, theater and cinemas.
And you think the Wahhabi establishment, the religious establishment, will accept this?
So far, they have accepted because they have no choice. They've become so weak, and also they've lost their legitimacy. So, for example, the ban on driving. For several years, the religious establishment said that it's really not permissible to allow women to drive because there is a principle in Islam which means that you should actually eliminate any temptation and outlaw it, lest it leads people astray. So women driving would lead men astray, cause chaos in the Muslim community, and therefore they objected to women driving. Then Mohammed bin Salman announces that on the 24th of June, women will be allowed to drive, and therefore the time has come and the fatwa has changed, and now women can drive, but drive according to the principles of Sharia. Some people would think that Saudi Arabia has entered the 21st century, but in reality, there are more rights to be demanded than the right to drive a car.
Madawi Al-Rasheed, thank you very much.
Thank you.